Good morning, everyone. My name is Sean Werrick. I'm a principal consultant here at Pragmatic Works, and I'm just going to go ahead and walk through Polybase. It's a feature of SQL Server 2016. It's one of my favorite features. I think they're all my favorite, but this one's super cool. So we're just going to kind of walk through, what it is, how to set it up, and then how you'd use it, and maybe troubleshoot if you have a couple of issues with it. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and step into it. I want to kind of dive into just a little bit of an overview about SQL 2016, just for those of you that maybe aren't aware of it. It did just come out last week for the full version. It's been in the community preview mode and release candidate for, oh gosh, I don't know, 6 months now. So pretty exciting times that they actually released it. So I just kind of wanted to walk through a couple of things about that. Just talking about the Gartner reports, up until a couple of years ago, Oracle was kind of the leader in the operational database management systems, and that's simply not the case anymore. And bear in mind, these Gartner reports are between 6 months and 12 months old. So this was with SQL Server 2014, and the database engine now is way more powerful than the 2014 engine. So it's now the leader and the most complete vision. As well as it's the most complete vision for business intelligence and analytics. And moving on, it's also in the leader quadrants for all of the other things that are out there. So basically anything that Microsoft is touching in terms of the BI platform, they're doing pretty well. Just to touch on a couple of the features here, and most importantly, the total cost of ownership. So we call that TCO. So those of you that have other products, whether it's Oracle or something else, cost of ownership is a big thing. It's not just the licensing, right? It's also the staff you have to support the product, the hardware that you need to actually run the product. So if we're comparing this to Oracle and comparing apples to apples, and you're to include the OLTP, the ETL, the data warehousing, the BI, the R server, all of that adds up to almost 12 times more than what it costs for SQL Server. And even Oracle DBAs, they can come out and say that it's not exactly right, but there is a substantial difference. And even if you're getting the customer discounts with Oracle, you've been with them for a long time, they cut you the deal, you're still looking at between 6 and 10 times more expensive than SQL Server Enterprise licensing. And the reason is everything is built in with SQL Server. So if you buy one product, you get them all. With Oracle, everything is kind of a la carte, so you're paying for each individual service, as we saw. So as I said, it's all built in. They're the industry leader in the OLTP, as we showed. A lot of Oracle users will tell you that, well, we use Oracle because it's the most secure database, and that simply isn't the case. For 6 years in a row, Microsoft SQL Server has been the least vulnerable database out there on the market. So it's also the highest performing. Oracle is number 5. Comes time to do some end-to-end mobile BI. It's a fraction of the cost of Oracle, and I've had some experience with Tableau. That's not a cheap product either. So, and then of course advanced analytics using in-database technology is a really cool feature. So we'll touch on that briefly, but this gives you the capability to actually do real-time analytics as opposed to waiting for your ETL to process. And the best part of this is if you're ever planning on moving to the cloud, it's seamless across the entire workload. So if you plan on moving from SQL 2016 up to Azure, whether it's SQL Database or SQL DW, there are some nuances, a couple of special exceptions, but the experience is the same from on-prem to the cloud. So one of the things I talked about was the in-memory capability. So you have the columnar indexes, you have the in-memory tables, and the way it worked in the past was your data is only your reporting is only as accurate as the last time your ETL ran, right? So we see the 2 to 24 hours over here. The customer swipes their credit card, it goes into the OLTP. You got to wait for your ETL to run, and then eventually it makes its way to your data warehouse. Could be anywhere from, and if you're fortunate enough, it may be a few minutes, but usually it's 12 to 24 hours. And then you find out, you've got some fraud going on. You can't do anything about it because by the time you find out about it, you've lost thousands and thousands of dollars. So the way it works now is you take that OLTP, you put that up into memory. It's a 10-to-1 compression ratio, about 100 times faster than disk-based queries, and you find out what's going on real time. Pretty cool. Those of you that are interested in the data science realm, you now have our server with SQL Server. So a couple of things that Microsoft has done with 2016 that they haven't done in the past is they made some really key acquisitions where they were coming up, in my opinion, just a little bit short. So SSRS is a big one. Another one was the R integration. So they went out and purchased a company called Revolution Analytics. Basically took that, bundled it, threw it all together, and now you can actually install that with SQL Server. So you don't have to be a data scientist. You don't have to know what's actually going on with the R code. You just have to know what the inputs are, what the outputs are, and what the actual R code does in terms of the high level. So you can go and actually download scripts from the Azure Marketplace, pull those into R, run your analytics, get your data sets. Pretty useful. So it's just another slide showing some of the capabilities and benefits there. Always encrypted is another nice one. So the way you had to do it before was the encryption was at the database level. They've taken that out, so even the DBA, no matter who you are, unless you have the key, you do not have access to the data. And the reason is the data is stored in the database with this ciphertext. The database does not hold the underlying value and decrypt it on the spot or encrypt it on the spot. It only contains the ciphertext. So what happens is when Joe comes out from from SSMS and they run a query with this social security number, what it does is it goes out to the ADO.NET library with that key. That key ciphers, creates a ciphertext with that social, and you get this hash here, and then using that hash you can actually match it back up to the right person. So once again, the database only stores the encrypted text, never in storing the actual values. Row-level security, this is, in my opinion, the one thing that Oracle had on SQL Server. For probably almost a decade, I think they've had it, but now they've finally stepped up their game. They've now got row-level security, and for example, if you're a nurse, what happens is you're only supposed to have access to people in your wing. You submit a query. This query, basically, it's kind of transformed using these functions and only getting patients that belong to the wing that you're assigned to, which is really nice. In the past, you had to use something like, analysis services, tabular, or multidimensional, or maybe even Power BI. You could actually do some row-level security. There is also dynamic data masking. It's completely transparent. This is at the database level, so if you're ever concerned about somebody having access to this data, probably don't want to data mask it. This is only something that would be exposed to the end users, but it's a completely seamless. You can actually turn this on at the database, not have to modify any of your applications, and the encryption, or I'm sorry, the masking will actually happen real time. It's almost like a function is called for every mass value. And then one of my personal favorites, because I'm not strong at all in the database area, is the query store. So if you were writing code before, you basically had to, submit a query and you'd kind of wait for it to finish before you could get the execution plan. Now it has the live query execution plan where you can see the execution plan as it's executing. It has this really nice graphical interface where you can compare multiple execution plans, force the one that you want. So every time it sees execution plan 1, 2, 3, 4, it will execute 2, 3, 4, 5. You can unforce it later. You can look at all the execution, the plans that go with it, compare by duration, CPU, reads, writes, a lot of capabilities all through a wizard. You do still have all the same capabilities using T-SQL if that's still your preference. And then of course another one is for those of you that are interested in the cloud in any capacity whatsoever, you do have the ability to stretch into Azure. So it has this kind of concept called hot and cold, where maybe you have 10 years of data, but your relational database is extremely expensive, so you want to keep all your hot data, the data that's going to be queried a lot, maybe the last 5 years of data on-prem, and you may push out the last 5 years before out there into Azure. So you'll stretch your order history, push all that out to Azure. And it's completely transparent, so when a user submits a query, they have no idea whether it's going to be on-prem or out there in Azure. SQL Server actually is smart enough to know what data sits where. And then my personal favorite, a complete overhaul, Microsoft purchased a company called DataZen. And so now you have all of the nice security and stability with reporting services combined with the nice visualizations and graphics that DataZen provided. So you have KPIs, mobile reports, and for those of you that don't know and those of you that do use Power BI, this will be able to render Power BI reports in the future. As of right now, you can upload it similar to how you would SharePoint. You just select the file, click upload, and it will show up similar to the way that paginated reports and these do, and it'll say Power BI reports. The only difference is when you click it right now, it will open up Power BI Desktop if you've got it installed, and that's how it would open. In the future, it will be able to render it. And of course, a lot of the updated report features, some of the new graphics, KPIs, and of course the mobile reporting piece is extremely nice. And actually this is, so for those of you that don't know too, there's an app for it. It's the Power BI app. You actually just point it to your reporting server and it will render all of your mobile reports. And you can brand the portal. So for those of you that come from a SharePoint background, you had your kind of web portal that you could create. You'd modify your CSS and make it look the way you want. Reporting services did not have that at all. But now you can actually change the logos and the colors to make it look however you'd like. It's not as deep and granular as SharePoint, but it's pretty good and pretty nice. So let's just go ahead and dive right into it. The whole premise behind Polybase and purpose is to get deeper insights across different data. So that would be relational and non-relational. So what is Polybase? Some of you heard the term, and those of you that have used it, you probably use it in APS or SQL DW or something, but it's a technology that accesses and combines non-relational and relational data all from within SQL Server without you having to know anything about Hadoop. So of course you're going to have to know how to set it up, but once you've got it set up, you're not going to have to know how to issue MapReduce jobs or know what node to tie to or none of that stuff. You're going to run your normal T-SQL queries, and you can actually choose whether you want the queries to push down computation to Hadoop or do it locally. And what happens is SQL Server, if you tell it to push the compute down, it will generate Hadoop MapReduce jobs and push that compute down to Hadoop where it will do the processing. But sometimes you may not want to do that. You might have an IoT solution where you don't want any performance hit on that Hadoop cluster, so you may want to do the compute locally, and what that would do then is pull that data up to TempDB, kind of translate it all into T-SQL, and execute a query plan, or execute a query on all that data. So Polybase is utilized, as I said, by SQL Server 2016. It's utilized by SQL DW and Analytics Platform Systems. So for those of you that have used any of these, they're all very similar, except that DW and APS are Microsoft's massive parallel processing systems, where one of them is in the cloud, which is the SQL DW, and of course one of them is on-prem, which is your APS. But they all kind of work the same way with Polybase, in that the only difference is with SQL DW, you can actually point to Azure blob storage, and I think the others, like SQL Server 2016 and APS, you're going to point to either Hadoop or blob storage. So what can Polybase do, right? You can query data stored in Hadoop. So you've got all this IoT data, or maybe you've got archive data. So that's the example that I use a lot. I know a lot of people put IoT out there, but when it comes down to it, Hadoop is extremely cheap, right? It's very scalable. It's very cost-effective. And for me, I would envision using it as something as an archiving type system. So I would constantly push out old data up to Hadoop, and maybe if I want to pull up some of my year-end financials, I would bring it back. Well, now you don't have to do that, right? Because you have that seamless integration. So you can actually do your analytics. You just might have to wait a little bit longer, depending on how good your Hadoop cluster is. But the query data is stored in Hadoop, so Polybase makes it easy to query the data using that T-SQL, like I said, so you don't have to know how to write MapReduce jobs. It does it for you. You can query data that's stored in Azure blob storage, so it's not only Hadoop, you can actually do Hortonworks, you can do Cloudera, you can do HD Insight, you can do Azure Blob Storage. And what a lot of people don't know is Azure Blob Storage is actually HDFS under the hood, so you can actually point to that as well. Once again, Polybase makes it easy to access the data because you get to use your T-SQL. You can integrate with BI tools, you can mirror with Power BI, all the tools that it's got. But the two things that I like the most about it, after the querying part, is the ability to import data from Hadoop, from Azure Blob Storage. So say you're just dumping a bunch of data out there from an IoT solution, you can quickly pull that in using what we call a CTAS, or create table as select, and point to that external table, and you can pull data in, and that can be part of your ETL process. So you no longer have to use SSIS. You could use a CTAS and pull that all in, or if you really wanted to, like I said, you could push it out. You could export that data to Hadoop or blob storage, doing the exact same thing, create table as. That will actually create MapReduce jobs, and then you would insert into those tables, and it automatically does it, passes it along to the Hadoop control node, and it goes to all of the data nodes. So once again, it gives you the ability to query relational, non-relational data across SQL Server and Hadoop. Gives you some insight across your data lake, so you can use the tools, faster time to insights, and like I said, you can actually simplify that ETL process using something like a CTAS that I mentioned before. So an example of this that I like is, say you have an auto insurance company, someone like Geico. So you have customer information that's on your SQL Server, and for those of you that have teenagers, which I've got one now, but she's not ready to drive yet, thankfully, you may have a sensor on your vehicle because you do get a discount based on how well the student drives, or your children drive. So they'll put a sensor on the car, and then they use that data to actually adjust your rate. So if you're a good driver, your rate drops. If you're a bad driver and you're always speeding, your rate goes up. So what you can do with Hadoop and with SQL Server and Polybase is tie the two together. So you can get real-time information and real-time quotes by joining Jim Gray or Ann Smith to their IoT data that's out there in Hadoop. And that's just one example, but another example that I actually heard from a customer today is you can have something like an auto company that does painting, and they have defects. They have a defect rate and all the sensor information where they can find out, all the temperature information and, all your product and paint information, and you can kind of combine all of that together to see, okay, if I just turn the temperature up by 1 degree, what's going to be the impact of my defects? Is it going to go up, down, all of those things? Polybase is another good example of how to do that. So let's talk about something that I was concerned about. So you hear all this, you're like, okay, great. It's similar to link servers, right? I've used that before. Performance was not very good. Well, remember, you can push the computation to Hadoop. So if you're worried about your SQL Server being impacted, the query optimizer will make a cost-based decision and push computation to Hadoop to improve the query performance. Now, you can turn that off. You can explicitly say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to impact any of my Hadoop cluster. Let's do all the compute in SQL Server. But what it does is it uses statistics on the external table to make cost-based decisions. So think about that. There are statistics on these external tables. So as they're being used, those statistics are you should update those statistics, but then it goes and looks at those, and you can write a better execution plan, which then creates a better MapReduce plan, which is pushed down to Hadoop to improve performance. So, and that last sentence says what I just said, basically. And then you can scale your compute resources. So, like I said, one of the great things about Hadoop is you can have 1, 2, well, I think it's pairs of 2, 2, 4, 8. You can have as many nodes as you want, pairs of 2s. You can keep scaling out your Hadoop node as many as you want. Polybase, you can do the same thing. You can actually have as many Polybase instances and scale it out as you want as well. So what you get is something like this. So you'll get your head node for SQL 2016. You can have other compute nodes. Those all point to the name node in HDFS in your Hadoop cluster, which then pass on all the processing to all those data nodes. So it's pretty powerful and pretty scalable, which is really nice. So let's talk about the Polybase requirements. What do you have to install it? Well, of course, you got to have SQL 2016, 64-bit. You got to have the .NET Framework 4.5, and this to me is a bit ironic, but you do have to have the Oracle JRE 7.5 or higher, which I say it's ironic because for those of you that don't know, Java is owned by Oracle. So you have to have the JRE to use Polybase. Of course, the minimum memory is 4 gig. You'd probably never use that. Same with the hard disk. You'd probably never use that. And then you have to have TCP/IP enabled. And then, of course, you're going to want an external data source, right? Now, this is all the different versions that it currently allows. So you can use Hadoop cluster Hortonworks, HTTP 1.3, Hortonworks 2.0 to 2.3. I think 2.3 is the latest. Cloudera, which I think that's considered probably the best Hadoop implementation out there. You got 4.3, and then 5.1 to 5.5, and then last but not least, you've got blob storage. Now, of all of these, the blob storage performs the worst, and obviously something like Cloudera would probably perform the best. And I actually missed the important one, but there is HD Insight in there too. So to set up Polybase, this is just a high-level view of it. We'll walk into each of these in a lot more detail, but got to install it. You're going to install the data movement service. You're going to install the engine. You're going to configure SQL Server, turn it on. You're going to configure whether you want push down or not. So that is a default. That is a default that you would have to basically point to. There's a yarn file that you would have to edit, and you can actually point to the Hadoop cluster, and I'll show you all that. But you have to configure that, and then you configure the external data source. What am I pointing to? Where's the Hadoop cluster sitting? What's my external file format? Create a Hadoop user. This is the authentication piece. How am I connecting to Hadoop? Am I, like for example, Hortonworks, maybe you're connecting with Huey, although hopefully not. And then finally, last but not least, you create your external table. So the Polybase configuration, this is all done via T-SQL. Okay, so first check to see if it's enabled. If it's already enabled, it doesn't give you an error message, it just tells you it's already enabled. But you can actually select server property as Polybase enabled. And then you do exec sp configure Hadoop connectivity. Now that 5 is telling you what version of Hadoop you're running. And I'll show you all those versions, and then you want to reconfigure it. But those versions, 0 will tell you to disable it, 1, etc., etc., etc. Now you'll notice 2, 4, and 7 are kind of the same thing. Don't know why they're there. Actually, I'm sorry. Yeah, 1, 4, and 7, those. But so if you're running Hortonworks 2.1, you'll want to specify 7. Hortonworks 2.0, that's obviously what I'm running, so I specify 5. And this is also the, I think it's a sandbox that I have out there on Azure. So you specify the version that you have. Now, the thing is here is you can have multiple Polybase setups, meaning you could point to different tables in different, so if you had 4 instances of Cloudera, you could actually have a different kind of link server, if you will, for each of those instances. However, they would have to be the same version because this is a SP configure, tells you that is a server property. So you're only allowed one version of Hadoop for each server configuration. Once you run that stored procedure, restart the SQL Server service, the SQL Server Polybase data movement service, and the Polybase engine. Next, decide whether you want to enable pushdown. Now remember, you can overwrite this, but you may, as a DBA, not want to allow this. If you are the Hadoop Cluster Administrator, you may not want that. You may say, no way, I'm not letting anybody push down any compute to my Hadoop cluster. So you may want to disable that. But if you want to enable it, all you got to do is go and find the yarn side XML file. It's in the default SQL Server path unless you changed it. You'll find a lot of these configurations. This is how you change it. SSRS is the same way. If you want to change a lot of the default configurations, you have to go to the bin file folder and change those configuration files. And then on the Hadoop machine, you're going to have to go out there and find and copy the configuration key that's in the yarn application class path, and then you'll paste that in the yarn site XML file and with that same exact property. And then if you want to scale out Polybase, by default it only puts one node. Obviously if you want to scale it out, this would be, you would install Polybase on another server and you would tell it, I already have this installed on server X, and you would point to that and make it a child node of that. So once again, it allows you to create a cluster of SQL Server instances to process some large data sets, so it scales out better, performs a lot better. So you just install Polybase on multiple machines, pick your SQL Server head node, and then you basically just do it with this store procedure here. Say join group, here's the node, the port, and the server name. So then you restart the data movement service on the compute node and you should be good to go. Once you've done that, you create your external data source. Wait a minute, did I miss one? So I'm missing one in here, but what you have to do, just one moment here. You have to create a user. So this is a little bit different. So there was CTP3, and the reason I didn't add that slide is I just missed that. This version just came out 5 days ago. But what it is you have to create external user, or a Hadoop user. So you have to create a Hadoop key, and then you have to create a database scope credential. And this is how you're going to connect to Hadoop. So you're going to, I'm calling it HTTP user, Hadoop user. The identity, this is my HUI account, and then you would specify the password, and then you create the external data source, give it a name, and then you point to the cluster, of course the port, and then what credential you're going to be authenticating with. So that's a really important piece, because if you don't do this part, you won't be able to connect to the cluster. So remember, create a master encryption key, create your Hadoop user with the username and password, then create your external data source pointing to the node and telling it what user to use. Now obviously you can have multiple users, right? So this is why maybe you have different data sources. So you may have multiple data sources, each one with different levels of security. So I could have HTTP admin, I could have HTTP read, I could have HTTP write. Each one of those within Hadoop could be granted certain permissions, and then you would create each of those users and map them to each of those data sources. And that would be okay because we are still pointing to the same Hadoop cluster. So, and then you just restart the data movement service. I think I told you that. Once you've created the user, then you create the external data source. I think I already showed you that. Tell it what user to use. And then you're going to tell it what the external file format is. So as you drop things into Hadoop or Data Lake, this is what your file structure looks like. Now this is obviously very important, right? This is like SSIs. It's kind of telling it what, not necessarily the metadata, but the format is, and this is an important part too, is the date format. So if you're coming from a system where it's MMMM dash data dash whatever it is, you have to specify that correctly. Otherwise, when you try to go and select that data, you'll get an error saying it didn't know how to convert it to a date. So this is extremely important, this date formatter. And then of course your field terminator could be, I made mine tab separated, but it could be comma separated. It could be just a comma there. And you could have multiple file formats, right? So this is tab separated value. You might have CSV, you might have PSV for pipe separated. You could you know, have a lot of different variations in there. And what happens though is once you do all of those things to actually kick it into gear and create that external table, you just run create external table with, you point to the location in the Hadoop cluster where that file is sitting, tell it what the data source is. Basically, this is the Hadoop cluster you're pointing to, what file format you have, and this tells you, there's a couple details around this, but they're not really that important for this webinar, but you can tell it what values to, how to reject it, and anyway, what to do with that. So using Polybase, and I'm going to walk through all those installation steps in a quick demo, but using Polybase, there are basically 3 ways that you would use Polybase. So I think I told you that those are the most important ones. You can select from it, so, or insert to it. So you may want to go ahead and pull all of your things from your customers and push that down to your Hadoop cluster. So you'll select here, insert, select into, so this would be your external table name. You can insert to, oh, sorry, I had that backwards, sorry. This would insert to SQL Server from Hadoop, sorry. This one would insert to Hadoop from SQL Server. So the important thing is here is make sure that the allow Polybase export is turned on, and make sure you hit the reconfigure after that. So you can create your external table, point to that location, and then to, so what this does, just so you know, this actually does create MapReduce jobs too, right? So it's going to create an actual Hadoop table. So if the table doesn't exist, it will create that table. And you have to make sure that, these match the data types. So if you don't, it'll cast them, but you want to have control over that. So you create your external table, tell it where you want it to sit, tell it what the data source is, all of those same things, and it will actually create it for you. And then you can insert into it on the next step. Excuse me. So using Polybase, you can do ad hoc queries, right? So you can select anything from your external table, and this is the option you're going to want to keep in mind. Option force external pushdown, or you can disable the external pushdown. So as a DBA, you may have some specific views. One of them may allow pushdown, one of them may not, and you may only allow your certain elite users that know how to query data correctly and only pull a couple of years or 3 years worth, as opposed to every single bit of data out there, right? So for the pushdown, it's important to know what it does and how it works. So use predicate pushdown. Try not to use likes and all those things. Try to do things where account balance. Predicate basically means true or false, right? So try to bring back a distinct subset of rows. So for example, we want to pull back where all the account balance is less than 200,000. I think a better example would be give me everything where the date key is less than 2001-0101 or greater than whatever it is. That is called predicate logic. So this will initiate a map reduce job and push that down to Hadoop. So you can use all of these expressions. So you can use less than, greater than, equal to, not equal to. You can use math, and you can use logical and unary operators as well. Null is null. So it follows the T-SQL syntax very closely. So let's talk about the troubleshooting. If you ever have any issues, you may want to know, well, I issued this query to Polybase, why is it taking so long? There's just a set of queries that I found that work pretty well. So if you want to find the longest running query, there's a lot of DMVs that you can select against, and I'll post these both on my blog and give this presentation to Liz, and she can share that out to everybody. But you can run things like getting the longest running query, find the longest running step, so that may be more important. For me, I think that would actually be a little bit better. Find the execution progress, so you kick something off, like what is going on, it's still cranking, why haven't I gotten a response back? this is how you'd find out where it's at. And then, looks like I pasted it twice. And then this is finding out what the external, just the external side of Polybase is doing, how long the map reduce is executing. And then you can actually go, if you wanted to via SSMS, you could go and look at the query plan. So it's a little bit strange, but what you would do is you select whatever from your external table, and you'll notice when you click on the execution plan, there's this little box here that says remote query, and you'll get the same thing when you do stretch database. It provided that it has to actually go out to Azure to get your data, that it's not on-prem. What you can do though is you can right-click on this and go to View XML, and it will show you the actual execution plan. So let me go back to my Hadoop cluster. So when you first start this up, first let's go to here. So to install it, you're going to go to New SQL Server. Hopefully, obviously you have the ISO, right? You go and run the setup file, come over here, do the New SQL Server standalone installation. You're going to go through, a couple of the, making sure you have the .NET framework, all of those things, to checking for updates. And then you're going to come over to here and you're going to select this feature called Polybase Query Service for external data. You'll click next, and it'll install it all. When you install it, you may think to yourself, well, I don't see it. It's not, there's nothing there. So if I expand this, you see external resources here, but it may not be there when you first start it up. And the reason is you have to configure it. So you'll come over to here. We'll once again run our SP configure. Make sure that's pointing to my Hortonworks sandbox. That's 5. You'll run that. You'll create your external file format. Then you'll create your encryption key and your Hadoop user. Then you'll create your external data source. Give it an alias, and this is how you're going to refer to it when you use the create table, external table. So you'll point to your Hadoop cluster, pass in your Hadoop user that you created right here. Then you'll go to external table. So this is one, fortunately Microsoft actually does have a new data set this year for SQL 2016. I think it's called Wide World Importers or something, but they don't have any solutions out there yet for SSIS and analysis service and stuff, so I still use our favorite bicycle demo. So I have the internet sales, and what I do is I create the external table, and this is where you define all the data types that you want internally. Now what you have to remember is you have to bear in mind what the data types are in Hadoop and that they will convert. So it's going to do an implicit cast, and sometimes it will convert. So for example, if you're trying to, if you have a product key and you're telling it it's an int, but maybe the data is actually a string and that key is XXXYY, this will not work. You'll get an error when it tries to create it. So I think it takes a small sample size of data and actually validates that the metadata will match and it will convert it. So you want to make sure that these match up correctly, and these are order specific. So however it shows up in Hadoop, so product key is first, or date key is first, second, etc., the order is specific. These match exactly with what's in my Hadoop cluster. And if I show you, I can show you here. So you can see I've got my 2016 running and I've got my Hadoop cluster running. I could go out to Hive. So let me, so I could go out to Hive here. Actually, I think it's 8888 if I remember right. Oh, that's the tutorial, so it was 8,000. And I could go over to here. Beeswax is the actual, that's Hortonworks, that's their Hive UI. Click on that, and if I go over to my tables, you'll see that I do have a fact internet sales. So what's important to remember, like I said, is that the data types and the order have to match. So you see I have product key first. All of these orders have to match all of these orders, and all the data types have to match. Now you can go from char to, a string to char and varchar and char, but it has to be string to string, number to number, etc. And if you cast it to the wrong type, you'll either get an error or it may truncate it. So if you're going from a decimal to an int, I think it just truncates it. I don't think you get an error. So definitely pay attention to all your data types here. So you can see these are all float. And if I were to make these int, I would lose a lot of that value. So you just run this, create the external table. At the very bottom, I specify where my table is, what the table is, and I just pointed to fact internet sales, what Hadoop cluster I'm pointing to. Remember, this is where I specify the cluster name with the port and what connection, what user I'm going to be connecting as, what the file format is. Once I do that, it will show up over here in the tables, over in the external tables, and there it is. So if you ever want to go and see, first off, go and see what your external resources are, go to your data sources, and you can see I'm pointing to this, and you can right-click and script it out and see exactly what it's pointing to. So you can see it's pointing to my Azure one. And then in terms of, where was the other one? So the external resources, and then you have your file formats. It's going to have my TSV, CSV, etc. And then there's, here it is. So you may want to go look at your actual Polybase cluster too. So I only have a head and a compute, which is the same node, right? But if you have multiple nodes, you'll see those all here as well. You'll have one head node and, two or more if you scaled it out. So that's interesting. And then, like I said, once you create that table, it will show up in your external tables file. So I wanted to go to, now here's a query. So I've got this all turned on. So this query pulls in my on-premise dim customer first name and last name, and it joins it to all of these other attributes in my Hadoop cluster, every single other one. And I'm going to go ahead and turn on the execution plan and show you. So you can see there is a remote query. So this is actually where it goes out to Hadoop and gets those rows. Now, like I said, you can right-click on it, show the execution plan XML, and it will actually show you what's being passed down. And it will show you, so here's one of the things to note. There's a lot of things for those of you that are probably better at Hadoop than I am. The estimated degree of parallelism, I think it kind of detects how many nodes there are. So I think mine has four nodes, so therefore it's going to have 4 degrees of parallelism. Some of these things, will tell you how it's going to perform. So if you don't know some of the details of your Hadoop cluster, you can go in here and look at some of these and see what's going to be passing back and forth. And so I think that's all the content that I have.
Okay. Are you able to see the questions, Sean?
Let me scroll over here.
And you can expand that. You can pull that panel out and expand it.
That's the right one. Questions, right? There we go. Okay, I got a few questions here. Can you provide resources for comparisons in the beginning of the presentation? So I can tell you So according to Gartner, so in terms of the comparisons, are you talking about, let me see, I think you're probably talking about performance. It does actually have a footnote saying where it came from. Let me scroll this over. It did come from specific metrics, third party. It wasn't their own databases or anything like that. It came from, it's not on theirs. Maybe it's, is it this one? Usually says it right here. I've got another presentation. I'll have to look that up. But they actually did quantify this. It wasn't just a random, I ran 5 queries and got this. They did some TPC-H, whatever that workload is that they run. They ran that through Oracle and SQL Server. And these are the older versions, by the way. So one is 2014. I think this is 2012. I can't remember what this is. Maybe this is different service packs. But so that's the answer I have for that. Can you install SQL 2016 in Windows 7? No, I think you have to have Windows 8 or 10. Presentation deck will be available? Yes. Will each of these SQL 2016, scroll this over so you guys can read too. Will each of these SQL 2016 Polybase nodes in the cluster require enterprise license each? Answer is yes. So there's, I have, where did I put it? I have a good, did I not put that on here? I had one. So there's a, do I have it here? Here it is. So there's a, if you go out to the Microsoft SQL Server website, there's a SQL 2016 edition datasheet. It actually doesn't explicitly say Polybase, which is kind of annoying, but it will tell you, for those of you that are interested in what features come and which ones do not. There are a lot of nice features that, believe it or not, come standard. One of them is the always on. It only includes 2 nodes, but that's a huge plus. Also being able to add the SSIS DB, so adding the SSIS project to that as well. In terms of Polybase, so this is enterprise is all per core. So if you have to install Polybase on other servers, if you want to scale it out, you have to pay for those cores as well. So the answer is yes. Polybase available in standard edition. It's an enterprise only feature. And yes, I will put this on my blog. It's the external resources for database or for instance? External. So that's a good question. So there are different levels to this. So when I run, so the external tables is at the database. So you'll notice the external tables, those are at the database. The actual external source, that's at the server. So you'd have to specify, that's in, let me see, where's that at? Oh, so it looks like that is at the database level. It's not, that's not using an SP. So that's at the database level. Do the data types convert automatically? So the answer is yes. It will try to convert them. It will try to, just like you would in regular SQL Server, it'll try to do an implicit cast, which is never a good thing to do because of performance issues. But if it does see a one-to-one, so like I said, if it's a number, it will convert it to an int successfully. Whether it's a float or any of those, it will convert it. But you may lose data, and then if it's an invalid data type, so if you're coming from a string to a number, and the string actually does have characters, it will actually throw an error. I can process data via scale-out Polybase connected to a Hadoop cluster on-premise. Scale-out Polybase. I'm not sure I understand the question, but you can connect wherever your Hadoop cluster is, whether it's Azure, on-prem, you can connect to it. So mine's up in Azure, and so is, you can see this to the cloudapp.net at the top of mine. My SQL Server instance and my Hadoop ones are out there in the cloud. Can it connect to Parquet format and query it directly? What exactly is Parquet format? I know I've heard of it. Is that a specific Hadoop implementation? Because if it wasn't listed on my list, it doesn't get included. So if it wasn't in, here we go, that list, then it won't get included. It won't work. Haley will send out my presentation, and I will actually also have it on my blog. It'll be seanwarrick.com. Just give me about a day or two, and I'll put that out there. Head node is enterprise. Oh, okay. David Benoit seems to think the head node is enterprise and the computes can be standard. I'd be interested to hear that, David. Any known gaps or issues upgrading from prior versions of SQL Server to SQL Server 2016? That's kind of an open-ended question, because anytime you upgrade, you want to always check that the compatibility, especially on the database side, once you flip those compatibility levels, that you're not going to have all sorts of blow-ups because your statistics are out of date, or the way that it computes the cardinality estimators are different. So the short answer is, in terms of upgrades, it should be pretty seamless, but you're always going to want to test. So if you're upgrading the database, baseline your database, and actually I have another presentation on the query store that actually talks about how to do that. You'd want to turn the query store on, look at a lot of your queries, turn it off, change the compatibility level of your data to SQL 2016, turn the query store back on, now check your queries again. If they're running worse, you can go back and force the old execution plan. So maybe the new cardinality estimator doesn't work as well as the old one. There are actually, believe it or not, specific cases where it does not work as well. So that's kind of open-ended, but I can answer that in a little bit more detail if you want to email me directly. To use Polybase, you would first create a Hive external table on your Hadoop cluster. David, you could. So you can connect to one that already exists there, or you can use the syntax like I said, where you actually, where'd it go? You can actually create, where'd it go? Here. You can actually create the external table here. What that does is it just creates a map reduce job that goes out and just creates the table in Hadoop, and then you can actually, so actually it's all this. And then so from here, this creates it, and then I'm missing a little bit of a statement here, but you then insert into that table from whatever your local table is. So you could do it there, or you could insert to one that's already there. Send you a link. I will put this, I'll put the different version, I'll put this PDF, I'll put a link to this up on my blog. SQL Server 2016 compatible with Visual Studio 2012. No, it is not. You have to have Visual Studio, I think it's 2013? Oops, let's see here. Right there, SQL Server Data Tools 2015. And it is free. So one thing to note, I don't think I mentioned it, but SQL 2016, it does, the developer license is free. So any developer can go out and download it, play with it, install it. That includes the data tools, that includes Polybase, that includes all of those things. The developer edition is free. And the developer edition comes with all of the same features. Remember, look at here. So here's Enterprise. Oh, they don't show the developer. The developer edition comes with all of the same features as Enterprise, I think with maybe a couple of exceptions. For example, maybe some of the always on stuff, but you can go out and do that all on your own. I don't think the developer edition is released yet. I think I looked out there just 2 days ago and it wasn't there, but it should be coming soon. So it is not compatible with Visual Studio 2012. Can these external sources be used out of Polybase just like Oracle? Yes. That's why I said it's very similar to a link server. So I used to use a lot of Oracle link servers, so it's exactly the same thing. Newest version of Data Tools 2015 is backward compatible. Yeah, I mean you can, so I think what Eric is saying is you can actually open up a 2012 solution in Visual Studio 2015, and you aren't forced to upgrade the solution to 2015. You can keep it 2012 and just do your development with that. The same thing comes with reporting services and all those things. So these, and I think it was the way with the other versions too, just because you pull in reporting services or deploy that to 2016 doesn't mean you have to upgrade them. You can keep them at that same compatibility level. I wouldn't, because I've seen zero impact, but you can. Any other questions? Oracle does have external table concepts. So that's where Polybase comes in. I know what you're talking about. So yeah, they've had that for a while. Polybase is the only way to do that. So you could drop your files in Azure Blob Storage. So the answer is yes, but you kind of have to do a little bit of workaround. You can't just point to CSVs. You'd have to point to Azure Data Lake or something like that. So I didn't put that on the list, but you can actually point to Azure Data Lake and not just blob storage. Any other questions?
I think if they haven't come through, that's probably it.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. If you do happen to think of some questions, you can feel free to email Sean. His email is swerick@pragmaticworks.com. If for some reason you forget that, you can email me, Liz. It's the email address that comes with all your GoToWebinar information. I'll be happy to pass along any questions to Sean. As he said, we will have the slide deck available, so he will have it on his blog at seanwerrick.com. Or if for some reason you forget that, you can email me, Liz, and I'll be happy to send it to you. Again, thanks everybody for joining us today, and don't forget we have another session dedicated to SQL Server 2016 on Thursday. We're doing sessions on Tuesday and Thursday this month to help you learn all about SQL 2016. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.